It's about to get interesting, so subscribe and hit like so you don't miss the top content.
I was sitting on the couch, staring at the TV screen, when the door opened and there was the sound of footsteps in the hallway. It was my wife, who had returned from a business trip. I got up to greet her and immediately noticed how radiant she was. Her eyes were glowing with joy and a smile was playing on her face that I hadn't seen in weeks. She tossed her bag into a corner and, without waiting for me to ask questions, began to tell me about her adventures in New York. I listened, immersed in her tales of meetings, conferences, and parties, but in the back of my mind I was tormented by the feeling that something was wrong. She was too happy, too energetic, and that joy seemed strange to me against the backdrop of the way she was leaving. I tried to concentrate on her words, but thoughts of what might have happened during her absence kept me going. She talked about her coworkers, about their time together, about how one of them, Jason, was a particularly interesting conversationalist. I couldn't help but notice how her voice changed slightly when she mentioned his name. Something inside me clenched, and I felt a chill run down my spine. That night we had dinner at our favorite restaurant, and I noticed her talking enthusiastically about her plans for the future. She talked about developing her career, getting involved in new projects, and maybe even moving to New York. I listened to her, but thoughts of Jason kept me on my toes. I couldn't understand why it bothered me so much. She'd always been ambitious, but now it sounded different, like something more was slipping into her words. The next day, I decided to do some housework to take my mind off the intrusive thoughts. I was cleaning our office when I came across some old pictures of her. One of them showed her with her friends at one of the parties, and I noticed that Jason was among them. I felt jealousy boil up in my chest. Why was I reacting this way? I knew she could socialize with anyone, but now it seemed like something more. In the evening as we sat on the couch, I noticed her checking her phone a lot. Every time it rang or a text came in, she would quickly put it away as if she was afraid I would see something. That became the final straw. I couldn't keep quiet any longer. I asked her about Jason, about how they were spending there. She began to explain how they were just friends, that nothing had happened between them. I listened to her, but a shadow of doubt was already creeping into my heart. I couldn't understand why her words were keeping me calm. I felt that there was something more lurking beneath the surface of this joy, and I needed to find out. I couldn't sleep at night, and thoughts of her business trip kept me awake. I decided I needed to find out more about what had happened in New York. I started looking for information about her coworkers, the company she worked for, and her trip. I knew it could be wrong, but I couldn't stop. Eventually, I came across an article about a conference she was at. It mentioned that some of the attendees were hanging out after the official part, and Jason was among them. This sent a wave of emotion through me, and I realized that I needed to find out the truth. I started digging deeper, and soon came across something that shocked me to the core. I found pictures from the very party where they were together, and in one of them they looked way too close. I knew I needed to confront her and ask her what really happened, but at that moment, I didn't know exactly how to do that. I felt like there was a storm brewing on the horizon and I needed to be prepared for what I might hear. I sat in the kitchen, staring out the window, trying to get my thoughts in order. I knew I needed to talk to my wife, but the fear of what I might hear was holding me back. I didn't know how to start the conversation. The moment she walked into the kitchen and asked what was wrong with me, I felt everything boiling inside me. I couldn't hide my suspicions any longer. When I finally gathered my thoughts, I decided it would be best to just ask a direct question. I asked her about Jason, about their time in New York, and about what really happened between them. Her response was instantaneous. She froze, and I noticed her eyes widen in surprise. She started to speak, but the words were jumbled and I couldn't catch a single thought. I felt the air around us grow heavy, as if tension hung in the room. She tried to calm me down, assuring me that nothing had happened between them, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't telling me the truth. I remembered the pictures I'd found, and at that moment I decided to be frank. I told her about my search, about what I had seen, and how it had upset me. I expected her to be furious, but instead her face turned even paler. I saw her lips twitch, and she finally gave in. She started talking about how they had really bonded in New York, but it was all on a friendship level. She talked about how Jason had been a support to her in times of need, how they'd worked on projects together. I listened to her, but in the back of my mind I continued to feel like something was missing. She mentioned that Jason was one of the few people who really understood her ambitions and dreams. There was a note of nostalgia in her voice, and I couldn't help but notice her warmly reminiscing about those days. In that moment, I realized it wasn't just about Jason, it was also about how she felt about her life, about how she was looking for support and understanding. I wondered if I had missed the opportunity to be that person for her. I was always busy working, and perhaps she was looking for something she couldn't find in our lives. After a long conversation, I suggested she go to New York together. I wanted to see the place where she spent her time and see what it was that attracted her so much. She was surprised, but agreed. I felt this could be a chance for both of us to reconnect and understand each other better. The next day we were already packing our bags. I could feel the excitement building. We arrived in New York, and I was amazed by the energy of the city. The huge skyscrapers, the bustling streets, the bright lights all created an atmosphere that was breathtaking. I noticed my wife glowing as we walked the streets, and it reminded me of how happy she was during her business trip. We visited the places she talked about, the convention center where her meeting was held, the cafe where she had lunch with her colleagues. I tried to listen to her, ask questions and share my impressions, but in the back of my mind, I still felt that something was wrong. I couldn't get the thought of Jason out of my mind. One night as we sat at a restaurant, I noticed she was getting messages on her phone. I didn't want to be pushy, but curiosity overpowered. I asked who it was and she, a little embarrassed, admitted it was Jason. I felt jealousy overwhelm me, but at the same time I realized that this was her life and I couldn't control her relationships with other people. However, I couldn't help but notice that she was becoming a little less open when it came to him. I decided I had to find out what was really going on. I began to watch her reactions, the way she interacted with Jason, and I soon realized that my suspicions weren't unfounded. Her laughter, her smile when she talked to him on the phone, all of it caused me to struggle internally. The next day I decided that I needed to meet Jason. I wanted to understand who he was and what he meant to my wife. I found his contact information and texted him, suggesting we meet for coffee. I didn't know what to expect, but I realized that this could be a pivotal moment in our story. The meeting with Jason was scheduled for the next day at a small cafe not far from where we were staying. I could feel the excitement building, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this was going to be a pivotal moment. I arrived at the cafe a little early to think about what I was going to say. Fear and determination struggled inside me. I knew I needed to be calm and collected to find out the truth. When Jason walked in, I immediately noticed his confidence. He was tall, with a charismatic smile, and his presence seemed to fill the space around him. I stood up to say hello, and though he extended his hand to me, I could feel the tension between us at that moment. We sat down at a table in the corner and I tried to start the conversation on a neutral note, asking about his work and how the conference had gone. Jason spoke confidently, but I noticed that he occasionally glanced at my phone, which was on the table. I could sense that he was trying to assess the situation, and at some point I decided it was time to get to the point. I bluntly asked him how he felt about my wife, and I noticed his face change for a moment. He faltered, and I realized that there was something more behind this friendship. He began to talk about how they met, how she inspired him with new ideas, and their time together in New York. I listened and there was sincerity in his words, but at the same time I felt like he wasn't saying everything. I asked the question I was most concerned about: was there any romance between them? He looked me in the eye and told me that they did get close, but it was more about support and understanding than feelings. I didn't know whether to believe him or not. After our meeting, I went back to the hotel with even more uncertainty. I told my wife about my conversation with Jason, and she seemed pleased that I had met with him, but I saw a shadow of concern in her eyes. We continued to discuss our feelings and what had happened in New York, and I felt an understanding between us. She admitted that she really valued her friendship with Jason, but assured me that her heart was always with me. The next day we decided to spend time together exploring the city. We walked around Central Park, enjoying the atmosphere and the conversation. I could feel the connection between us slowly re-establishing itself, but at the same time, my thoughts about Jason were still on my mind. I realized that I needed to let go of my fears and trust her, but it wasn't easy. That evening, when we got back to the hotel, I noticed her checking her phone again. I felt jealousy boiling up inside me and I couldn't resist asking her a question. She replied that they were just work messages, but I realized that didn't reassure me. I suggested she leave her phone in the other room so we could spend time alone and she agreed. We spent the evening discussing our dreams and future plans. I told her about my fears and how hard it was for me to accept her friendship with Jason. She listened to me, and I saw understanding in her eyes. She promised to be more open and honest with me, and that gave me hope. The next day, however, as we were about to leave, something unexpected happened. I found a card from Jason in her bag, writing how happy he was to spend time with her and how much he valued their friendship. I felt my chest prickle with jealousy and uncertainty. I didn't know how to respond. In that moment, I realized that I had a decision to make: either trust her and let go of my fears or continue to live with my doubts. I decided to talk to her, and when she came back to the room, I showed her the card. Her face changed, and I could see her starting to realize that her friendship with Jason might be perceived differently. She explained that it was just a show of friendship, but I realized that it might not be as simple as it seemed. We both knew we needed to decide how to move forward. In that moment, I realized that everything that had happened in New York had been a test for both of us. I didn't know what our future would look like, but one thing was clear: we needed to be honest with each other and decide what we wanted out of this life. We were on the threshold of a new phase, and our choices would determine whether we could regain what we had lost or go our separate ways, leaving only shadows of the past behind us. The moment I showed my wife the card from Jason, tension hung in the air. I could feel a lump of emotion growing in my chest from jealousy to fear. She looked at me carefully, and I saw her face change. I knew this was going to be a pivotal moment for both of us. She took a deep breath and began to speak. She confessed that she really felt different in New York. She was looking for the support and understanding that was missing in our daily lives. She said that Jason had become a friend to her, but nothing more. I listened to her, and while it was hard for me to accept that she felt alone, I realized it was true. We were both immersed in our own worries and work, and perhaps that was the reason she sought solace in her friendship with him. I asked her how she felt about Jason now, and her answer surprised me. She said that even though they were close, she realized that the real connection she had was with me. She remembered all our moments together, all the joys and hardships we had experienced together. There was sincerity in her voice, and I felt the storm in my heart begin to subside. We discussed how we needed to change our lives so we wouldn't make the same mistakes. I suggested that she start activities that would bring us closer together, and she happily agreed. We decided that we would spend more time together, talk about what was bothering us and support each other in difficult moments. It wasn't easy, but I felt it was the right path. The next morning we left New York City, and I noticed the hopeful glow in her eyes. We looked out at the city together from the cab window, and I realized that this trip was not just a vacation for us, but an important milestone in our relationship. We learned to be more open with each other and realized that trust is the foundation upon which strong relationships are built. When we returned home, we started a new chapter in our lives. We enrolled in courses on topics we were interested in, started spending evenings reading books and discussing ideas. I noticed how she began to glow again, and that pleased me. We became closer than ever, and I realized that despite the trials we had been through, our love had only grown stronger. A few months later, as we celebrated our anniversary, I decided I wanted to do something special. I invited her to the same cafe where we met in New York City. As we sat at the table, I remembered that moment when everything seemed uncertain. I took her hand and told her how much I appreciated her and our connection. At that moment, I realized that all the trials we went through made us stronger. We became a team that was ready to overcome any difficulties together. I didn't know what was ahead of us, but I was sure that together we would overcome any challenges. And the moment she smiled at me, I realized that we had found not only each other, but ourselves. We were ready for new adventures, and this was just the beginning of our story. 5 years. 5 years have passed since we returned from New York, since the day our lives began to change. Right now, I'm sitting on the terrace of our house, watching the sunset and thinking about how things have changed. We live in a small town in Northern California, away from the noise of the metropolitan areas. It's quiet, peaceful, and just what we need. But looking back, I realize that the path we have traveled has been far from easy. After that trip, we really became closer. We started talking more, sharing our thoughts and feelings more. We enrolled in dance classes, which became not just a hobby, but a way for us to get closer. Every Saturday we danced to old jazz tunes, and in those moments I could feel the connection between us that we had almost lost. We started traveling more, discovering new places, and every time we returned home, I felt our love grow stronger. But life, as always, wasn't perfect. A year after our trip to New York, she went on another business trip, this time to Chicago. I remember seeing her off at the airport, how she smiled at me, promising me that everything would be fine. But doubt crept inside me again. I didn't want to be the kind of person who doubted all the time, but past experiences had left a deep mark. I tried not to show my fears, but they were with me. Every day while she was away, I caught myself checking her messages, her social media, looking for any hints. I hated myself for it, but I couldn't stop. When she came back, I noticed immediately that something had changed. She was happy, full of energy, but there was something in her eyes that I couldn't understand. She talked about her successes, about her new projects, about how her career was on the upswing. I was happy for her, but at the same time I could feel the distance between us reappearing. She started spending more time at work, staying in the office more often, and I began to notice that we were drifting apart again. One night when she fell asleep, I picked up her phone. I knew it was wrong, that it was a violation of her privacy, but I couldn't resist. I opened her messages and started reading, and what I saw made my heart stop. She was texting him, Jason. Their correspondence was full of tenderness, jokes, hints that they had spent more time together than she was saying. They planned to meet again, and it wasn't just business communication. It was something more, something that was ruining everything we had. I put my phone back down and walked outside. The night was cold, but I didn't feel it. I stood on the porch and looked up at the stars, trying to make sense of what I had just learned. My wife, the woman I loved more than anything in the world, was cheating on me, and she was happy in a way she hadn't been happy with me in a long time. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to live with it, but I knew one thing. I had to know the whole truth, even if it ruined me, even if it ruined us. I woke up the next morning with a heavy feeling in my chest. She was already in the kitchen, making breakfast. She smiled at me as if nothing had happened and offered me coffee. I sat down at the table, looking at her, and felt something inside me start to crumble. She was so beautiful, so happy, and I realized that this happiness had nothing to do with me. I decided not to tell her what I'd found out. Not yet. I wanted to know more. I wanted to understand how far it went, and I knew that to do that, I'd have to go to extreme lengths. I'd have to become something I never wanted to be. I'd have to follow her. So I took the day off work that day and followed her. She said she was going to a meeting with coworkers, but I knew she wasn't. I saw her get into her car and drive towards downtown. I followed her, trying to keep my distance. She stopped in front of a small cafe and I saw her go inside. I parked in the distance and waited. A few minutes later, I saw him. He got out of his car and walked into the cafe. He was tall, well-dressed, with a confident gait. I watched him walk over to her table as they smiled at each other. How he took her hand and kissed it, and in that moment, I knew it was over, that my life as I knew it no longer existed. I sat in the car watching them and felt something inside me die. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to move on, but I knew one thing. I had to find out the whole truth, even if it ruined me, even if it ruined us. I woke up the next morning with a heavy feeling in my chest. She was already in the kitchen, making breakfast. She smiled at me as if nothing had happened and offered me coffee. I sat down at the table, looking at her, and felt something inside me start to crumble. She was so beautiful, so happy, and I realized that this happiness had nothing to do with me. I decided not to tell her what I'd found out. Not yet. I wanted to know more. I wanted to understand how far it went, and I knew that to do that, I'd have to go to extreme lengths. I'd have to become something I never wanted to be. I'd have to follow her. So I took the day off work that day and I followed her. She said she was going to a meeting with coworkers, but I knew she wasn't. I watched as she got into her car and drove toward downtown. I followed her, trying to keep my distance. She stopped in front of a small cafe, and I saw her go inside. I parked in the distance and waited. A few minutes later, I saw him. He got out of the car and walked into the cafe. He was tall, well-dressed, with a confident gait. I watched as he walked over to her table, as they smiled at each other, how he took her hand and kissed it, and in that moment, I realized it was over, that my life as I knew it no longer existed. I sat in the car, watching them, and I felt something inside me die. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to move on with my life, but I knew one thing. I had to find out the whole truth, even if it ruined me, even if it ruined us. I woke up the next morning with a heavy feeling in my chest. She was already in the kitchen, making breakfast. She smiled at me as if nothing had happened and offered me coffee. I sat down at the table, looking at her, and felt something inside me start to crumble. She was so beautiful, so happy, and I realized that this happiness had nothing to do with me. I decided not to tell her what I'd found out. Not yet. I wanted to know more. I wanted to understand how far it went, and I knew that to do that, I'd have to go to extreme lengths. I'd have to become something I never wanted to be. I'd have to follow her. That day I took the day off work and followed her. She said she was going to a meeting with coworkers, but I knew she wasn't. I saw her get into her car and drive towards the city center. I followed her, trying to keep my distance. She stopped in front of a small cafe and I saw her go inside. I parked in the distance and waited. A few minutes later, I saw him. He got out of his car and walked into the cafe. He was tall, well-dressed, with a confident gait. I watched him walk over to her table as they smiled at each other. How he took her hand and kissed it, and in that moment, I realized it was over, that my life as I knew it no longer existed. I sat in the car, watching them, and I felt something inside me die. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to move on with my life. But I knew one thing, I had to find out the whole truth, even if it ruined me, even if it ruined us.